Welcome to Soil Sessions, a webinar series by the Soil Health Partnership. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Stacy McCracken, the Communication Lead for SHP. Before we get started, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. All attending lines are muted. Please use the Q&A feature if you would like to ask a question, and I will help our host facilitate the chat dialogue. As a reminder, a recording of this webinar will be emailed to you later this week. We will also post a recording on our website. To begin this soil session about field check protocol, please join me in welcoming our three hosts. To begin the soil session, Dustin Brucker, Field Manager for Iowa, will start the presentation.
Hi, my name is Dustin Brucker, and I'm the Field Manager for Western Iowa here. I've been with the team for about 6 months now, and this is our first season getting into our field check protocols, which I'll be happy to describe for you today. We're describing the field check protocols and some of the things we've been seeing in Western Iowa and at a national stage as well. But first, we'll start off describing what we saw this past fall and winter. As many of you know, we had a late harvest in the fall of 19, cold and wet conditions, including the 13th coldest and the 18th wettest October in Iowa anyway, caused a slow harvest that went well into November, which caused a lot of late plantings of cover crops, if at all. Some of them didn't get done until November, December, and some had to do a little bit of frost seeding. All this meant that there's very little cover crop growth in the fall. But we did see some growth out of it in the spring when it did come up. As you can see here, there's an image of our strip trials here in Iowa. There's a cereal rye on the left before the burn down, and on the right you'll see after the burn down. So we have a nice delineation of our strips of our control versus our treatment. And what we saw was if you were able to drill your cover crops this year, we saw good results. Aerial applications had a bit of a slow to moderate crop growth. We did see some slow growth with aerial flown into soybeans. It was poor establishment. A lot of that seed to soil contact not get established, which caused poor growth. Again, we can see on the right here, we have a good burn down prior to planting. And again, with a caveat with cereal rye here, they burn it down 10 to 14 days prior to planting to ensure good cover crop or good cash crop growth there. Here's another image of some drilled cereal rye. On the left, we have 15-inch rows air drilled on some terrain there. And on the right, we have some tighter drilled cereal rye as well. And again, it caused the fall drilling of cereal rye, saw some great growth in the spring. Give some good time, good temperatures for it to grow. As far as cereal rye is concerned, we saw that 80% of our SHP growers use cereal rye in their 19 cover crop planting, and it was about 50% of our mixes this past year as well. So we had a lot of it's a well-known cover crop, easy to work with. You planted it in the spring and the fall, and some winter seed, frost seeding as well. So it's a good intro into cover crops for many growers. Now we'll start talking about some of the field checks that we're doing. So this is the first year that we've been taking their standardized notes for all of our plots in SHP. Our agronomy team at SHP put together a great field book and a plan for us field managers to use to take standardized notes on all our plots. Well in-depth notes that we all took. They describe in pictures with how to rate the different metrics we're looking for. So the 4 field checks we'll be taking each year will be the first field check will be post-harvest or cover crop planting. Again, that'll be right after harvest and when our growers get our cover crop established to see if there's any early season growth, how well we did, make sure it's done right. Field check 2, that happens in the spring. That'll be the pre-plant where we go out and see how it's growing in the spring. If it got established, we've taken some metrics on how much it's growing, if there's any other diseases or pests out there at the time, cover crop growth, the tillers, and soil temperatures as well. Field check 3 is post-planting. We should see a nice burn down there at that point with from our cover crops. We also take at that time, we should have a good establishment, a good growth in our cash crops. So we'll take our measurements like plant height and stand count at that time. Field check 4 will be our mid-season, where we're towards the end of after the ears and corn have set, and we've seen some pods and soybeans. That we're going to go out and take some measurements, ear size, diameter, get some good metrics on what we expect the yield to be, as well as some of those other agronomic notes. One caveat this year was that with all of our great planning, we still have to we have inconsistent sampling due to some social distancing restrictions put in place due to COVID-19. So some places were able to travel a little more than others, take some more notes than others. Western Iowa, I was able to get out and get some good coverage. Other states, not so much. It's all based on how our states let us travel. So that's one caveat. So here's some infield measurements that we took, some examples. This would be some of our cover crop. This would be our field check 2. We like to take some notes on a variety of cover crop species. Again, cereal rye was very popular, but we did have a number of growers who tried different things and different quantities of cover crops in the mix. So we like to take the note of what was planted, what's growing. Sometimes we plant cover crops that just don't grow, so I like to take note of that. We also get a stand count where we count the number of plants per square foot, and then we use that to estimate the plants per acre. We estimate the ground cover based on our no-till or reduced till or conventional till practices. That'll give us usually a pretty good estimate of the low, medium, or high ground cover for our fields. As you can see here in our pictures, we have again our drilled soybeans. Or I'm sorry, we have our drilled soybeans on the left, and then our broadcast. Drilled cereal rye on the left, and the broadcast cereal rye on the right there, with our flags noting the location. These locations we return to each time for all 4 checks. So we get a good trend over time of the same location. You can see our 1 square foot frame that we use to measure both our ground cover and our cover crop planting. So here's a good image on the left of no-till soybeans planted in the corn residue on a no-till field. And on the right, we have some cereal rye residue after a spring burn down. So you can kind of see it there a little bit, and that's a mid-July corn. So we can still see it hanging around there, giving good coverage for the ground there, even in mid-July. Gives comfortable level for our plants to grow and keep our beneficial insects and bacteria in the ground doing good work for us in the field. But also helps with weed suppression too. As you can see, there's very little growth of weeds in there. It's given our cash crops the best chance to perform well through the season. Here's another look at cereal rye growth. Now again, with our field check 2, we like to measure the plant height, the tiller count for cereal rye, grasses like cereal rye. We have some tillers here on the left. We'll see there's about 5 or 6 tillers here. We also count the total plants again with our 1 square foot frame, and then we do the soil temperatures as well. Here's our 1 square foot frame and some about 8 to 10 inch cereal rye here. We have our thermometers in the ground there measuring the soil temperatures at 4 inches. We like to keep that consistent, making sure we're getting the same depth at all spots in the field all year long. So we have the same tools for each measurement to avoid deviation to throw off our data here. And on the right here, we'll see another image of some good tillering going on in some cereal rye. So this one was planted with, it was drilled in southern Iowa here in the fall, and it had great growth in the fall, then even better growth in the spring. So this is a really good looking field here of cereal rye. So when we are measuring these, we do take again we measure the tiller count. We get an average about 3 to 4 plants, so we get a good look at it to get a good average here. We also take measurements of the weediness of the field. Try to give some examples of some of the weeds we're seeing out there and the pressure we're seeing. Low, medium, high, of course. Here we see clockwise from the top left. We see some parsnip, some morning glory in there, some mare's tail, and common sunflower. we're seeing a lot of water hemp and mare's tail going on. And we're seeing some of those as being throughout the state. We're seeing those as chemical resistant, so herbicide resistant plants here. So we got to keep that in mind when we're planting our cover crops and using our burn downs of making sure that our resistant plants are being taken care of. So this is all information we can then send back to our growers saying, we're still seeing some of this out here. Keep an eye on it. Maybe take another pass at it with a different chemistry to try and knock it back a little bit. Here's an image of a field, one of our corn fields that was planted green. So this is a cereal rye broadcast field, and the growers planted green into it. Now again, when we're planting with cereal rye, we need to have some management practices in place to optimize the growth of the growth potential of the cash crop. So some examples of those are we need to have plenty of nitrogen as starter to give our corn seed a boost coming out of the ground there. It's a good practice to plant into a strip band where we can give a good zone of growth there for the corn seed, and also planting the seed at least 2 inches of depth to get that seed down there and get a good chance to grow. So you can see here our tape measure we bring out to measure our plant growth here in the field check 3 actually. Again, with field check 3, we're doing our seedling growth measurements. We're doing our seed depths, the plant height, the growth stage, and the soil temperature. We're doing this multiple times. We're doing about 4 times in each field at different locations to get a good view of our control versus our treatment. So our controls, again, are an example like my field will have a control being a no cover crop planted versus the treatment where we have the cover crop planted. In the treatment, we could have, again, a single species, multiple species, where we can compare the two. So this is a good example of a control versus this is a soybeans versus corn. And we'll take this again, a control versus treatments. So some of the tools we take with us, we take a tape measure, we have our shovel and our thermometer. And in some cases, we bring out a hula hoop. Now, a hula hoop is used to measure our stand counts and some drilled soybeans or small seeds. Anything that's drilled, it's tougher to get a tape measure stand count, so we'll have a hula hoop, and we'll use a multiplying factor to determine the stand count of the field based on the diameter of the hula hoop, of course. Again, this is a nice tool that our agronomy team has come up with. They built us the tools to do multipliers to give us a good estimate of our cover crop and our cash crop stands. Again, we use multiplying factors to figure out the distance and the range and multiply it to get the stand count for the field. So now we'll roll into some of the conditions that we were seeing here, both in Iowa and across the upper Midwest here. In Iowa here, we had some favorable weather in April, except for a little band here in the week of April 13th to the 19th, a bit of a dip in the temperature, which had a big departure from our normal, as you can see here in the image on the right. The average temperatures were at least 15 degrees colder than the average for that stretch of days. And the forest soil temperatures were in the 40s, with a little bit of snowfall happening in southern Iowa. So some growers saw some windows there in early April to go out and try and plant. But if you look at the 10-day forecast, you saw it dip down. Maybe you held off a little bit and you saved yourself some trouble from early season frost. So that was a challenge that we had to deal with. But then we did see some nice favorable weather after that. So we see the accumulated precipitation in Iowa in April on the left and in May on the right. Not too much is good. Good opportunities to get out in the field and get some stuff planted. Good windows. Short of that cold snap in mid-April. We got a lot of planting done. So in Iowa here, we got about 80% of all the corn was planted within 2 weeks of late April. A lot of you, the growers, can attest to that. They're hitting the ground running in late April. Tractors were all over the place, and we're getting some good work done. So that's good to see. It was a better spring than we've seen in the past few years. We were about 2 weeks ahead of the 5-year average for planting, and we were about a month ahead of last year's, if you recall. So last year in 2019 was a very cold and wet spring, and just kept going on. This year we had a very favorable conditions. We got about, May 26th, we had about 97% of the corn was planted and 92% of the soybeans were planted. So in Iowa, so we had a good run there through April and May. You can see here for the national averages as well. Looks like both Iowa and Minnesota, a little bit of Nebraska were ahead of schedule for the were above average for early spring progress. And other states as well saw a little bit ahead of average here. So, especially when you consider last year, I think it's pretty good telling mark there. Post planting, especially here in Iowa, we saw we started getting some separation. So I'd say we have a tale of two Iowas here. We have a western Iowa, a wet western Iowa, and a very dry eastern Iowa. Now, I'm sorry, I got that backwards. Very dry western Iowa and very wet eastern Iowa. I represent the western Iowa, and so we're seeing all this light rainfall from these dry conditions. They did allow for a good early season, field work. We had some side dressing, some herbicide applications. We were able to get out and get some of that field work done. But now we're still waiting on some rains. We did see some early season interseeding for some farmers who were getting out there in B3, 4, 5, getting some interseeding done. Saw some interesting tactics there. Seeing some good growth out of it as well. But we do need to have some of those rains come through to help us out with both our calf crop and some of our early season interseeding going on. That was the accumulated precipitation. Here's a very telling image, a couple images here that tell the 30-day and the 90-day departure from the 30-year average. So on the left here, we have the 30-day from June 10th to July 9th. That's a good early season growing stage. And we can see we're in Greene counties, Boone counties here in western Iowa. We're seeing some real departures from our normal here. We're starting to see it here in late July as well. Again, some curling of the leaves. We can use some good moisture here. Again, the 90-day average as well from April 11th to July 9th is the same conditions. Now in eastern Iowa, we are getting a little bit too much rain in some places, some flooding out. We can sure use some of that out west. So we can't quite figure it out. We can't get a good average here in Iowa, but it is showing some pretty interesting imagery here through the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship website. Here we've got some good images. So here's a look at the temperature and climate here in Iowa. The temperature, the departure from normal. So it's a little bit deviation, a little bit warmer than before the previous 30 years. And again, here's the drought monitor here off to the right here. We see the most recent report where western Iowa is getting some into those middling stages of drought conditions here. We use some rains, so this is what we're looking at here. And here we see the north central, the corn growing states here at large. Again, we're seeing some hot and humid temperatures they're draining the good soil moisture, and we'll start to see some effects here, especially growing through the reproductive stages here of tasseling and pollination in corn and soybeans. We can use some moisture here through these stages here. So with that, I will now pass it over to Jim Isermann, the field manager for northern Illinois and Wisconsin. He'll talk about what he's seen out there.
Thank you, Dustin. So yeah, we're going to move on to talking a little bit about primarily Illinois, maybe a little bit discussions of northern Illinois and up in Wisconsin. But Dustin did a great job of talking through a lot of the protocols and things that we're trying to measure here. So we're going to concentrate a little more on the high-level challenges and successes that we've seen in Illinois over the last year. So similar to Iowa, starting off, the cover crop year for 2020 starts way back in 2019. Growers thinking through how they're going to get those cover crops established. So last year being that late wet year that it was for so many people, right off the bat, many growers knew that it was going to be a pretty good challenge to get those cover crops going. So we did see a pretty good increase in interest, at least on our plots in Illinois, of growers looking to do some aerial applications. And these are growers that are experienced enough. They realize that's not always the ideal way to do things, but they were also looking at that, looking at the calendar dates, looking at the reality of getting the job done to get those cover crops out there. So we did see some growers move to some more aerial applications. As Dustin mentioned, in that situation, particularly in soybeans, oftentimes there's some slow growth. Last year really didn't give a whole lot of opportunity for those winter kill cover crops to express themselves much and give us a whole lot of benefit. So if you see in this picture, we actually did get pretty good stands. The fields that were applied, the plants did get up, there was a stand establishment there, but then by the time we got those crops off, it was pretty late in the year, so we didn't have a whole lot of growth. So we did work with a lot of growers to try to encourage some sort of an overwintering cover crop in those mixes. So in this field, you can see a scenario where we had radishes and ryegrass. And even though we didn't get a whole lot of radishes come springtime, we did have a pretty good establishment of annual ryegrass coming up in the field. So this was a field that was strip tilled. It will be going into corn. Yes, that ryegrass is still kind of short and small, but since it's that annual ryegrass, we know it's got a really great root structure to it. We got the strip tilled area to plant the corn, and we were able to get some success out of these types of fields. As we look at the next slide, the same kind of scenario played out. This was an interseeding application farmer that went in with a Hagee. Come back in the fall, probably was a little disappointed not seeing a whole lot of growth come out just because of the lateness of the year. But come springtime, you can see he's got a pretty good stand establishment there. He was fairly happy with it. It wasn't perfect. These aerial applications, oftentimes they got weak spots to them, interseeding applications. But nonetheless, he's got a cover crop established, and this is going to give him some good benefits. So you can see there, we're coming in the springtime, doing the square, using the 1 foot square to try to estimate what's going on with this cover crop. And Dustin mentioned a little bit about the tillering, and that is something that we're working to try to capture, because if you were to look down in that frame, there's really not a lot of plants there, but the tillering component of it, it really compensates a lot. So that's one thing we're looking at. That's something that can relate in terms of seeding rates and seeding dates and all that, trying to capture the effect that tillering can have on a crop such as cereal rye. So this field is cereal rye. The previous field in the picture beforehand was an annual ryegrass field. So they're a little bit different types of cover crops, but we're seeing both of them used to some degree across the program. So we look at the next slide, we kind of fast forward into the springtime, which was very different than what we saw in spring of 2019. So spring of 2019, we saw a lot of growers planting into very tall cereal rye cover crops, mostly in soybeans, fortunately. So for the most part, they worked out all right. A few instances where we had some cereal rye ahead of corn where it kind of got much more growth than we hoped for. But this year was a much better experience for most growers. They were getting that termination done earlier and able to get those get the soybeans planted into much better conditions. We still continue to struggle a little bit with soil temperatures. And again, that's something we mentioned, we take that as a measurement, but as we continue to plant soybeans earlier and earlier, we start to run into some issues where the cover crop, the soil temperatures are being held back a little more compared to a controlled treatment, whether it be no-till or a tillage treatment. So it's trying to come up with strategies in terms of maybe it's just termination, or maybe it's strip tilling, or reducing the seeding rates or something like that to try to help determine how can we improve those kind of outcomes so we don't have those kinds of problems. But by and large, we were able to see pretty good stands in the soybeans, sometimes even better stands where the cover crop was for various reasons. So kind of got off to a much better start this spring compared to last spring for the cover crops. So in this slide, the previous slide, we had probably pretty early termination ahead of the grower planting. And this is a slide where the grower went into planting green. And so let's maybe take a quick minute to address a question that had popped up in the Q&A a few minutes ago when Dustin mentioned about terminating the cover crops 10 to 14 days ahead of planting. And as it was mentioned in the Q&A, a lot of growers are planting green or terminating right after planting, that type of scenario. And there's a whole lot to the concept of planting green. We could probably have an entire webinar just on the pros and cons and the ins and outs of do you plant green or terminate early. And it's one of the reasons that cover crops to an extent will always be a little bit of an art and not always 100% science. But for growers who are starting off and are really trying to mitigate that downside risk, it's still a pretty good recommendation to get out early to terminate that cover crop to avoid any issues. I say that, but it's if you can terminate it in the case of cereal rye prior to that 12 to 18 inch stage. Once it gets beyond that, that's when we need to start having a good discussion about planting green, just so that we avoid having dense, wet, and mat out there, because if we wait too long and we are trying to go out and terminate a rye cover crop when it's 24 to 36 inches tall and we can't plant right away, that's when we run the risk of having a lot of dead biomass out there and creating a wet scenario. And we saw a lot of growers recognize that last year. It was, maybe not an ideal situation, but that's where we saw a lot of those growers. They were hitting that point in the spring of 2019, realizing that they couldn't, if they were to terminate at that time and not be able to plant, they might run into issues. So they were planting green quite a bit last year to avoid that. And this picture was a little bit different scenario. The soil temperatures were warm. This farmer wanted to get out and be able to plant his crop pretty soon. So he was trying to get some more growth out of the cover crop in that scenario. You can see we don't have a tremendous amount of biomass. On the right-hand side, he got the soybeans popping out of the ground real quickly, and he'll get that cover crop is, I believe, already sprayed in that picture, and will be dying off pretty quick. So there's a lot to the question of, do you plant green or do you not plant green? But if the cover crop is still around 12 inches, 18 inches tall, you can still, it's pretty good risk mitigation. If you're concerned about having problems, there's nothing wrong with getting out and getting it terminated early on, particularly ahead of corn. That it's something that we want to watch and be careful with in terms of making sure that we don't start that corn crop off on the wrong foot. So then we moved on from last year. It was definitely more of a struggle sometimes when we were planting those soybeans, even into that tall rye. But this year we saw some benefits from the cover crops. Not on all fields. Some fields there were still some there's pros and cons no matter where you are. But this is kind of highlighting a situation where we looked at the tillage, a till treatment versus a tillage versus a cover crop treatment. And we saw a pretty good benefit in terms of emergence for the cover crop. So this is something that we're working to try to rank and quantify. And like we say, certain years the cover crop would be a benefit. In certain years, maybe it's not. So how often is it? How often is it not? This field today, you really probably couldn't tell much of a difference if you just walked out there. We'll see how it plays out on the yield side. But that's part of the goals of these types of field checks and protocols, is to try to determine, how often are we seeing success. And again, nice picture. This rye tillered very well. So this might have been a little bit of a lower seeding rate that the farmer applied in the fall, but nonetheless, it had good growth conditions, and we were able to see the cereal rye do very well in the springtime. As we go to the next picture, this is that same field, and just kind of highlighting the pros and cons again. On the left, we had the tillage, and on the right, it was a no-till into the cover crop. And since it was kind of wet conditions, the tilled ground kind of gave that crusting and kind of held back the emergence. Ultimately, they did all come out of the ground, but they were just in the ground a lot longer and worked hard to get out of the ground. On the right-hand side, even though we had the slot, which is not ideal, it wasn't throughout the whole field, but there were certainly parts like that. Having that cover crop out there held that moisture in. Those beans were able to germinate and take off going. So a scenario where every year is different. This could have played out differently, but this year the cover crop proved to be a benefit in getting this cash crop of soybeans out of the ground and going. So we look at the next, the next slide that we're looking at. We are also trying to monitor the insect question. So this is a big one too. We didn't have a lot of overall concerns about insects in Illinois. But there were some pockets of it. So this is something farmers really need to be very vigilant when you are having a cover crop field, and even a no-till fields to an extent. There's a reason we do tillage, and sometimes it makes some things easier. You might not have as many of some of the issues that you might have. But even though we didn't hear it at a large scale, there was no huge slug outbreaks or armyworm issues. There were still some pockets and some individual farmers who had some issues. So it's important to always, make sure that you're out looking at your field, taking a look at it. You can't always wait to read about it in the newspaper before you go out and check your field. You need to make sure that you're being vigilant. And we are doing some work, just sending some insects to the University of Illinois here in Illinois, trying to gauge, are we seeing more beneficial insects in the cover crop fields versus the non-cover crop. So here we saw a lot of beetles this year. For some reason, we didn't see quite as many earthworms in the work that we're doing this year, but we still saw, a lot of those ground beetles, which are beneficial. They're giving us those good good predators out there doing good things. And this isn't something that's applied across the program at this point, but we're just kind of, one of the things we're looking at is how do we measure those benefits. So finally kind of wrapping up, looking at, we talked a lot about residue, and I mentioned some about the cooler soil temperatures in the springtime, which sometimes were causing us a little bit of some issues with the cover crops because it's a little bit slower growth, but this is kind of highlighting the benefit later on in the year. Ironically, this is actually last year's cover crop residue that you're seeing there. This field had a tremendous amount of cereal rye the year before. So this grower kind of got a good deal. He got 2 years worth of cover crop residue for the price of one. But you can see this is starting to get more into the growing season. This is taken kind of early morning. And if you can't read the differences in the soil temperatures, we're looking at a difference between 80.6 degrees versus 74.7 degrees where there's some residue. And this isn't quite to the point where it would be tremendously detrimental, but it is a time of year when we were going into a pretty good dry spell. We went for quite a few weeks after this measurement was taken without rain. So having that additional heat on the soil was certainly helping to burn up some of that moisture, probably not really hitting a point where we're detrimental to the microbiology yet, but that could certainly be happening on some hotter days taken later on. So it's one of those things. It's a benefit at this time of the year. Maybe earlier in the spring, it might cause us some struggles, but as we get into the growing season, having that residue out there, keeping the soil temperatures cool, can actually start to be a pretty good benefit for us. So my final slide here is looking at just some of the innovations that farmers are taking. Again, last year showed them once again that they can't necessarily count on going out after cash crop harvest. This is from a plot in northern Illinois. I see a lot of this, this is from a couple different plots, I believe, with some growers, but a grower in northern Illinois and some guys up in Wisconsin that are really starting to look at this early seeding, interseeding of just different species. So, this is a plot where a grower is trying out some multiple treatments just to see what happens. So just another way that farmers are trying to work through innovation to find new ways to establish cover crops. It's something that we're trying to collect in our protocols because we do have some growers starting to experiment with these types of systems on our SHP plots as well. New technology, new ways of thinking, and we're just trying to go through and find good ways to capture that type of information. So with that, that's kind of wrapping up what I had. I see we had some questions come up. So, but I think in the interest of time, we'll turn this over to Kristin Poley, who will answer a couple of these as she goes through with the data that we've collected, and she'll go a little more in depth on what we're doing with the data once it comes in, and what are the different ways we can look at it. So, Kristin.
Thanks, John. My name is Kristin Poley. I am the Michigan Research Manager for the Soil Partnership, and I am based in mid-Michigan. So, Dustin and Jim did a great job describing some of the measurements that we take and some of our protocols for how we make observations during the growing season. But now we're going to take a look at some of the data that is coming in from across the network. Here at SHP, we have named our in-field data collection efforts field checks. There are 4 of them that will be referenced through this part of the webinar. But first, I'll go over our data collection platform that we've chosen to work with, and then I'll share some of the data that has come in from field checks 2 and 3 specifically. Each field check has a specific set of questions related to the season, but there are also questions that are consistent through each field check. So as Dustin mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, field check 1 is our fall cover crop establishment check. Field check 2 is our spring cover crop establishment check. And these 2 field checks are going to have many similarities in the questions as they are both evaluating the cover crops. Field check 3 is our post-planting early season cash crop check. And field check 4 is our mid to late season cash crop check. And some of the metrics like soil temperature, residue cover, weed, disease, and insect ratings are included on every field check so we can track these over time. We have chosen to use Survey123 as our data collection platform for these field checks. Survey123 is an app within the realm of ArcGIS Online. This tool allows us to fully integrate our spatial and tabular data sets, which means that each field check submission is not only linked to our spatial data set, but also to our soils data and any other data that we might collect from the field throughout the year. Survey123 is easy to customize to our needs and is also very easy to use out in the field, which was an important consideration for us when we were choosing which platform to move forward with. This app is available across operating systems as well, so everyone on our team has access to it. And probably most importantly, this tool allows us to track field observations in a very timely manner, which is great for our team, but more importantly, it's great for getting the results back to our farmers at the time of the year when it would be most valuable to them. Next, I have some pictures of the Survey123 interface. This tool makes it easy to choose which field location you're at, and then the survey questions open right up on your phone or tablet. So on the picture on the left-hand side with the map, if I were to zoom in on that picture, you would see each of the 4 points that we submit a survey for every field in the network. And then the picture in the middle is an example of what the survey would look like for each of those points. On every field check, we ask for a specific picture to be taken from the field. These pictures are submitted along with the survey data. Of course, we encourage many other pictures to be taken throughout this process to document any interesting or troublesome things that are happening out in the field. But by doing this, we have a more consistent visual of each field. So the pictures that I have up here on the right are pictures that were taken during our spring cover crop establishment. So we have the frame view at a single sampling point. And then we also take pictures at the landscape level, looking at the strip level. And here we can see differences between the cover crop and some planted cash crops. Possibly one of the greatest benefits for us to using Survey123 and ArcGIS Online is the ability to see submissions and data in basically real time. This map is an example of what we could see on our ArcGIS Online interface. So when a survey is submitted, the appropriate field dot will change from orange to green to signify that there is data attached to it. And if I were to click on one of the green dots, we would be able to see all of the raw data submitted for that site across the entire field check process. So any data submitted, we would be able to see on this map. And this allows us to track progress across the network, but we're also able to create dashboards of data summaries and basic statistics that we can automatically populate from this map. So it really streamlines the process, and it's been a great tool for us so far. Next, I'll go into some of our data summaries coming in from 2020 so far, starting with Field Check 2, which is, again, our spring cover crop establishment field check. SHP recently published our 2019 cover crop report, which included data collected from fall 2019 cover crop establishment. And in that report, we found that grass cover crops were the most popular species group of cover crops planted across the network, both as a single species and as part of a mix. So it's not a surprise here to see that 47% of the sites that had a cover crop established this spring and that were sampled reported having a grass cover crop present. So because of that information, we're going to focus on grasses for Field Check 2. The pie chart in the upper right-hand corner is showing cover crop coverage, again, just focusing on a grass cover crop. What we're seeing here is that 48% of sites sampled had less than 25% cover crop ground coverage. Now, this is not the same as residue on the soil surface, but actually looking at the living cover crop and how much of the ground is covered by the cover crop. And this is the brown slice of the pie chart there. The next largest group shows 30% of sites sampled had 75% to 100% cover crop ground coverage. So that's the gray slice of the pie chart. So it's really interesting that the two largest groups fell on opposite ends of the spectrum, ranging from 0% up to nearly 100% cover crop ground coverage. But the final graph here on this side might help to explain some of this. This graph is showing the height of the grass cover crop at the time the field check was completed. The majority of surveys were submitted when the grass was just 1 to 5 inches tall, which could translate into less cover crop ground coverage with the grass being really that short. And we can see across the other measurements there, less than 5 fields were showing 15 to 20 inch height of grass and 20 to 25 inch height of grass. So when this field check data set is more complete, we can start to look at other cover crop species groups in the same way, things like legumes and brassicas. And we can also try and see if there might be differences between planting a cover crop as a single species or cover crop mixes. The next thing that we can look at from field check 2 is the cover crop stand count. Continuing again with grasses here, we see a pretty wide range running from less than 148,000 plants per acre up to almost 600,000 plants per acre. And the average grass cover crop stand count on these sites fell somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 plants per acre, which is still a pretty wide range. So it's really interesting to see all the strategy that goes into to this seeding rates. Moving on now to field check 3. This is our post-plant early season cash crop check. And first, we're just going to take a quick look at what's out there this year. 54% of our sites sampled already this year are corn and 44% are soybean. We also want to know the growth stage of the cash crop at the time of the field check. So on the left, we have corn. Growth stage V3 is the predominant stage with 42 survey submissions at the time of this field check 3 early season. But we had at least one submission at every growth stage from V1 to V8. For soybeans on the right-hand side, the second and third trifoliate stages were the dominant stages with 32 submissions each. It's important to note that this slide and the next pieces of data that I show are at the field scale, the whole field. So we're moving away from the individual sample points and looking at aggregating over the entire field. We've not yet begun to tease apart differences that may exist between treatment and control for things like stand counts, which is what we're looking at next. This figure is showing the range and average stand counts for corn across the network, again taken at the whole field scale. Corn stand counts range from less than 25,000 plants per acre up to 37,000 plants per acre. And we can see a couple of peaks in the data with popular stand counts around 30,000 plants per acre and another one around 33,000. But the average right now with the data that we have is 31,000 plants per acre. In soybeans, we see a very wide range of stand counts, ranging from less than or equal to 47,000 plants per acre, all the way up to more than 138,000 plants per acre. There is a peak right around 111,000, but the average is up closer to 125,000 plants per acre. With data on stand counts like this as part of our data set, we can investigate how row spacing, emergence, stand counts, and cover crops together might impact yield and other factors that could be important to soil health. Now, there are some measurements that, like I mentioned, that we take at every field check, and this can give us an indication of how that metric might change over the course of the growing season. Residue ratings are one of those metrics. In these figures, we're looking at the residue rating at the strip level for just the treatment strips and comparing field check 2 to field check 3. So remember that we take a survey submission at every point. There are 4 points in the field that we take these observations at, but instead of looking at just the residue at each point, we're looking at the entire strip level. So that's what's really under consideration here. The treatment in this case is going to include residue from cover crops and from the previous cash crop, possibly. For field check 2, our spring cover crop establishment check, 60% of fields reported a high residue rating of 50% to 100% residue cover, with 30% of fields reporting a medium residue rating and nearly 20% reporting a low residue rating. As we shift to field check 3, after the cover crop has been terminated and the cash crop has been planted, the percentage of fields with a high residue rating is slightly lower, around 55%, but really the pattern remains the same, with just a little bit below field check 2 for the medium and the low percentages. And these are some pictures on the top of the screen here out of Illinois, some of the pictures that are coming in which is always fun to look at when those pictures come in from the field. As we continue collecting this measurement throughout the growing season, we hope to see that the percentages of fields with a high residue cover decrease as the residue begins to decompose. Now, as both Dustin and Jim touched on, residue cover plays an important role in maintaining soil moisture and soil temperature. So next, we'll take a look at how soil temperature has changed from our early season checks to our mid-season checks. These figures are just a little bit more complicated. We are comparing soil temperature differences between the treatment and control at the strip level, and also between field checks 2 and field checks 3. So the treatment is going to be strips with a cover crop residue and previous cash crop residue, and the control is going to be strips with only previous cash crop residue. And of course, the type of tillage can greatly impact these ratings. The top graph is looking at just field check 2, and here we see that when residue is low for both the treatment and control, the control strips are around 4 degrees warmer than the treatment strips. But when residue is high on both the treatment and control, the temperatures are just about equal there. Looking later in the season at field check 3, when soil temperature and residue become important for conserving soil moisture, we again see that when residue is low, the control strips are approximately 3 degrees warmer, but when residue is high, the treatment strips are almost a full degree cooler. What's interesting on this field check 3 graph is the median residue, where the treatment strips are nearly 2 degrees warmer than the control strips. So this is an interesting find, and our data set's not quite complete yet for this year, but we'll continue to monitor this change as we go through the season. There's one other way, though, that we can consider the soil temperature data, and that's to compare the treatment and control strips regardless of the residue level. So now we're disregarding residue and only looking at differences between treatment and control strips that are paired across the field. So we take 4 sample points across the field, and for every pair of those, we have 1 treatment and 1 control. So now we're looking at the differences between those pairs. So by doing this in field check 2, the early season cover crop check, the control strips are 0.26 degrees warmer on average than the treatment strips. And when we move to field check 3, this difference is larger, with control strips on average 0.98 degrees warmer than the treatment strips. So what else can this data set tell us? During this part of the presentation, I primarily looked at single field check metrics, sometimes at the point level and sometimes at the level of the whole field. And I also looked at some differences between treatment and control for very specific metrics. But this really is just the beginning of what we can do with this data. We can continue to tease apart any differences that may exist between treatment and control, while also adding complexity by looking at the relationships between and among multiple factors. We can also look at this data set at the state level or by soil type, and yield and soil data are other valuable data sets that we have and that will be added to the mix when it comes time to further analysis. What I didn't show during this presentation was the types of management data that we also collect from each field, things like tillage and other inputs. This information can be used in economic analyses and will also help us understand how farmers are managing things like cover crops on their farm and how that might change over time as more experience with those cover crops is gained. Ultimately, a data set like this will allow us to answer long-term research questions and to examine big picture issues like environmental benefits and farm economics.
Thank you so much for joining today's soil session, and especially for the great engagement. As mentioned earlier, we will send a follow-up email with a recording of today's presentation. And as Jim mentioned, please don't hesitate to reach out to any field manager or any staffer if you have specific questions for your region. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to hosting our next soil session in September. Have a good day.